Hello everyone, so today I'm going to be redoing the first ever video I posted on YouTube, which was a bit of a fact file on my knifefish species. It's fair to say that that was an introduction to YouTube and it was pretty shocking, so I want to redo it because these fish are awesome and they deserve a lot better, and there's not a huge amount of content on them. So for those of you that are slightly newer to my channel and may not have come across this species before, these are Brachyhypopomus gauderio. Pronunciation potentially off, but they're a small sort of blunt-nosed species of knifefish, and a lot of the knifefish species are much larger than these ones. This species is incredibly hard to find here in the UK, and I imagine it's probably quite difficult to find elsewhere as well, and I'm really fortunate to have a group of them in my fish room. So why would someone want to keep a brown fish that's nocturnal and you really just never really see it in the daylight? And to me, I find them really interesting for a few reasons. Firstly, knifefish have an elongated anal fin which undulates, and that's how they propel themselves through the water. Not only forwards like all other species of fish, but they can also swim backwards, which is quite a novel way of swimming and very rare in the fish species we keep. These swimming patterns and the undulating fin can create a really awesome and almost mesmerizing display, and it definitely draws my eye every time I see it. I just think it's such a beautiful and relaxing thing to watch. And then they also can create electronic currents in the water. And now this isn't something that you can see or hear or do anything with, but it just makes this species and the family as a whole fascinating to me. I mean, they're just a fish that creates electric. That's awesome. They use these pulses to navigate at night, to hunt the little invertebrates that they eat in these dark waters. They also use them to communicate with each other. So I know a lot of people sort of, do fish have personality? Can they actually converse with each other? How do they communicate? Well, these fish, we know they communicate through these electronic signals. So yeah, you may not notice or even know that that's going on, but to me, and probably a lot of fish geeks, that's so cool to have a fish that's communicating constantly. So where do they come from? Well, this species, they come from the more southern areas of South America, where it's slightly cooler. They're found across 4 different river systems: the Paraguay, Uruguay, Parana, and the Tramandi. I think that's how you pronounce those. So these blunt-nosed knifefish are always found in slow-moving water. So things like riverbanks, lagoons, flooded meadows are all the sorts of habitats that these fish would inhabit. The waters are typically quite clear to slightly tinted. They're definitely not the dark tints that you would see in sort of places like the Rio Negro. But the lighting and the brightness of that is still very subdued due to the abundant floating and emergent vegetation in these areas. The habitat is often sort of densely covered by water lettuce and water hyacinth, floating on the surface, providing them shelter in the roots, but also shade from the dense canopy of leaves. In these southern areas of the continent, the water parameters can change quite considerably over the year through the different seasons that occur. These fish are almost what I would call temperate, in that they can tolerate temperatures down to about 17 degrees Celsius up to about 27 degrees Celsius. That's a huge 10-degree difference throughout their seasons, and we can replicate that in our habitats and actually save ourselves a bit of money on heating. However, it is worth noting that during the colder spells, the fish do slow down a bit, they feed less, and they definitely will not be producing any eggs. In terms of the actual water parameters that you want to keep these fish in, again, they do change quite a lot because there's a lot of rainy coming through the rain seasons. So that will change the parameters of the river systems quite considerably. But typically you want to aim for a near neutral pH, anything from about 6 to 6.5 up to about 7.5 would be acceptable. You definitely want to avoid the extremes, unlike what you would do for a lot of the South American species, which like to be sort of below 6. So that makes them a bit easier to look after. Water hardness in terms of the alkalinity, I would say anything up to about 5 DKH would be acceptable. You probably don't want to be aiming too low because you don't want to have a real fluctuating or a real drop in your pH. These fish are quite messy. They do like a lot of food. So having a bit more alkalinity there to act as a buffer for your pH and keep it near neutral is probably advisable. Many of the species of knifefish that do make it into the aquarium trade do grow really big. And now that's why I love this species, because you can keep them in a moderately sized aquarium, as you can see next to me. This tank is 100 centimeters by 50 by 40, a 200 litre total volume. And that's fairly manageable for most people in their home aquariums or even in their fish rooms. So it does make them a little bit more achievable for many of us. I know personally, the black ghost knifefish has always captivated me when I see them in shops, but I'm never going to have a tank big enough for that species, and I'm sure a lot of people aren't either. So this is it's a gateway into this awesome family without having to break the budget and reconfigure the house to fit in a giant aquarium. Once you've worked out the size of tank you're going to go for, it's then time for the fun part, decorating your aquarium. And now these fish aren't overly fussy when it comes to botanicals. You can see that I've gone for a really dense, varied botanical bed in my aquarium, but because they don't need those tannin waters, you don't actually have to use these. I think they're great for providing a bit of extra shelter and an extra food source for any smaller individuals that are in there. But for you, if you don't like that look, you don't have to keep them with these sorts of environments. But there are some considerations to make when planning your aquarium. The first one is that you do not want any sharp edges in your tank. If you're going to include rocks in this aquarium, then you want to make sure you're using rounded cobbled type stones rather than pointy sharp bits of lava rock or some of these Cereus stones and stuff like that, which can have those sharp edges. Like you can see here, I've gone for a rounded river cobble. This is really important because these knifefish have skin, not scales, and are really easily damaged by these sharp edges. And being nocturnal, not really, and also liking to hide, they do tend to bump into, scrape against, hide underneath all the ornaments that are in your tank, and that can cause skin infections and eventually death in these species. So staying clear of anything sharp is absolute must. And now I mentioned Cereus stone there, which is not actually an inert rock, so it does have some calcium carbonate in it, which will dissolve and alter your water chemistry. And now with this species, it's not dramatically an issue when it comes to raising your carbonate hardness and therefore your pH. But personally speaking, I would try and keep them with all things that are inert, that aren't going to impact your, or at least not going to rise. Obviously, the botanicals aren't inert. They're going to slowly release a few tannins and drop that pH slightly. But as long as you've got a decent amount of alkalinity in there, that's going to buffer it and keep it stable. But adding in something like an ocean rock or anything really calcium carbonate based, coral sands, it's going to just cause you to have problems with your source water not matching your home aquarium, creating constant change and quite sudden change, and it's probably going to help slowly drift your aquarium away from what they want. And then the final thing is cover and shelters. And what you use for this is entirely up to you. I've made a little cave inside this wooden log. I've got botanicals all over the place, and I've got dense areas of plants where the fish like to hide in all of these different places. You could use pipe work, clay pots, rock clays, as long as they're not sharp. Anything like that will work absolutely, but you just want to give them places to hide and shelter from the bright light. Good amount of abundant vegetation, especially floating vegetation, like I said earlier, that's where they come from. So get some water lettuce in your tank or any of your favourite floating plants and just get the surface covered in that. They'll absolutely love it. They'll thank you for it by becoming far braver and be out during the day. So I've covered quite a bit about what you need to keep these fish, but I've not covered how you feed them once you've got them. And for these fish, they're never going to take dry or prepared diets like pellets, flakes, tablets, anything like that. They're just not ever interested. I've tried, they do not care about it. So what you have to do is feed live and frozen foods. And now the biggest diversity that you can offer them, the better, because you can make sure they're not going to get any sort of vitamin deficiencies and lack nutrients that they absolutely require. I feed things like Daphnia, copepods, bloodworms, mosquito larvae. I also feed blackworms, tubifex. Any of those sorts of things are great. If you're not sure how to feed some of these things, check out my live food video. I'll link it in the description, and it will go through some brilliant options and tips along the way. As you would have noticed while watching this video, nothing's really happening next to me. There's no movement, there's no fish, there's just quite a boring tank. So If you're not wanting something like this in your home aquarium, because it's pretty boring and everyone that comes and visits your home says, where are all the fish? What are you doing? You're a weirdo, which is what I get quite a lot. You can add tank mates to your knifefish aquarium. There are a few rules that I would stick to, but generally speaking, they're actually quite peaceful to other species. Their mouth is quite small. They're not a fish eater, so they shouldn't actually try and attack anyone other than very small fry that might fit in their mouths. If I was to stock another species in this tank, it would absolutely be Hyphosabricomelaches. They are biotope correct, they can tolerate the same water parameters, including the wide range of temperatures, so it won't stop you from doing the seasonal changes. They're active, they're small, they're very peaceful, so they're not going to damage or annoy the sensitive skin of the knifefish. And they're going to live in completely different areas of the tank, so they're not going to compete for these shy nocturnal species. They're not going to be down stealing all their food from in amongst the botanicals. They're going to stay at the surface and eat what you give them up the top there. So that would be my choice. Other options could be things like the Rathbun's tetra, although they can be slightly nippier. They do still come from that sort of region and can tolerate those water chemistries. And one of the splashing tetras, Pyrrhia australis, I think is the pronunciation. Really hard to get. I've only ever seen one person have them, which was Ty. But yeah, they are biotope correct as well and stick to the surface areas of the tank and will just completely stay out of the way of the knifefish. So a really good option. Some of the other options could be from that region. Some of the Pistogramma borellii or Trifasciata, I think, are both found in those sort of southern areas of South America. And Corydoras plateus, the peppered cory, they're also biotope correct and would be fine in those sort of lower temperatures as well. But they will be more likely to have little disagreements and steal the food of the knifefish. So I'd be wary of adding those to your tank. Some of the small sort of Rasboras and Danios may also work, but I just check on their temperature requirements. Personally speaking, I always quite like to try and keep stuff biotope correct, so I'd still go towards the Alachis, the Reed Tetra, personally. And finally, you may have noticed this weird tube that looks very out of place in my tank, and it does have a purpose, I promise. So it's here for breeding purposes. These fish are actually really clever and quite interesting in their parental care, and that the males will pick up eggs once spawning with the females and deposit them through the little holes in these tubes. Clearly in the wild, they probably put them in little holes in sunken wood and in between branches and plants and things like that, little caves and stuff to keep the eggs safe. But in the aquarium, they'll happily use this tube, and it makes it really clear and obvious when they spawn, because I can see little yellow eggs in the tube very easily. This means I can remove the eggs once they've spawned and move them to a different tank and keep an eye on them. They are quite prone to getting fungal infections, the water mold, so I can get them out and treat them with methylene blue to prevent that, which is really helpful, which I wouldn't be able to do if they just left the eggs in the tank. So that's a real bonus about it. So I have done this a few times. They typically hatch around 3 to 4 days at sort of 25 degrees Celsius, that is, with them hatching with a very large yolk sac, which will support them for another sort of 4 days after hatching. At that point, they are big enough to eat very newly hatched baby brine shrimp, but I imagine some of the small micro worm cultures that people have would also be a suitable food for these young fish, potentially. Also, Paramecium rotifers may be fine for the first couple of days, but they do get quite big quite quickly, so I'd move them on to something chunkier like the baby brine shrimp or some of the worm cultures quite quickly after they've started feeding. One of my previous batches I did manage to grow on till about 2 months, and they were starting to look like miniature versions of the adults, and they were adorable. Unfortunately, when I moved them to a new tank to rear them up and grow them on, they got a skin infection, and I couldn't save them. Unfortunately, with these fish not having scales, they're quite sensitive to medications and obviously, like I said, infections. So once it took hold and once it was noticeable, it was unfortunately too late and I couldn't do anything about it. So I'm going to keep trying, and hopefully I'll be able to raise some young soon and make these fish more available here in the UK. So if you're lucky enough to get a group of these fish, then you might want to breed them yourself. And if that's the case, you want to make sure that you've got obviously both males and females. And luckily, it's quite easy to tell them apart. Once you've got yourself some mature specimens, so typically you're probably going to get juveniles, you're going to need to grow them up a bit first. But once they're mature, the males will be slightly bigger, slightly longer than the females, and the females will be slightly more rounded and rotund around the abdomen. quite typical for a lot of species. But the easier way to tell is that the male's tail will be laterally compressed. That sort of means it's been flattened a bit like a paddle, whereas the female will be sort of narrow and to a point. And it's quite an obvious difference when you can see them side by side. I will overlay some footage for you to have a look at as well, and see for yourself so you can sort of familiarise yourself with those differences in case you ever get a chance to see them in the flesh. So I did mention earlier that I would actually quite like to stock this tank with some reed tetra as well. And I may do it one day, but if I was to do that, I would quite like a slightly larger aquarium. Like I said, this one is a metre long, and I actually have a bit of space here down the end to probably add up to about 120 centimetre long tank. And it's currently 50 by 50, but 50 by 40, but I reckon I can go to about 55 by 50 tank. The Fluval Sienna looks like a possible option for me. I think it's a 355 litre, 335 litre, whichever one. I'll put the dimensions and stuff on the screen. But I believe it was about 110 centimetres, so I still had 10 centimetres to play with in the length, 50 by 50, something like that, or 55 by 55. Either way, I've measured it and it does just about fit in this space, so that is potentially something I could look to do in the future. But at the moment, with all the tanks that I've got a few empty ones, I've got a few projects with the Nano rack behind me. I've got too much to do, and I don't have enough money to buy a new tank yet. So that's on the back burner for now, but maybe if you come back in the future, I may be able to upgrade this tank and add in a bit more interest with some small shoaling species as well. I think that's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. If you'd like to know anything that I haven't covered in this video, please do reach out, leave me a comment, send me a message on Instagram. I'm always willing to chat fish. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you all soon. Lots more to come, lots more to do, and a busy weekend ahead.